Imagine for 1 second that you are entering a cage with a tiger that hasn't eaten for a week, but you have no whip, no gun, not even a protective suit, only your name and trembling hands that cannot hold a glass of water. The date is November the 23rd, 1990, and the setting is not a boxing ring in Manila or Kinshasa, but a sun-scorched, tension-filled Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, frozen in anticipation of the most destructive war of the late 20th century. Sitting in the presidential palace is Saddam Hussein, a dictator whose name induces cold sweats in Western leaders, a man who has just annexed Kuwait, ordered the execution of hundreds of his generals for the slightest suspicion of disloyalty, and is now playing the cruelest game of his life, using thousands of foreign citizens as human shields at strategic military sites. The air in the region is so electrified that a single spark is enough for a nuclear explosion, and it is at this very moment that a plane lands at Baghdad airport, carrying a man whose presence here seems like absolute, surreal madness. It is Muhammad Ali, but forget the image that pops into your head, the image of the dancing athlete who floats like a butterfly. The man descending the ramp is a shadow, a ghost of former greatness. His body shakes with uncontrollable tremors. His speech has turned into an unintelligible whisper, and his face is frozen in a Parkinson's mask, devoid of emotion. You think his status as a global icon guarantees his safety? You think dictators respect sports legends? That is exactly the mistake many made before him. But Saddam Hussein is not a sports fan. He is a pragmatic killer for whom Ali is nothing more than a pawn on the geopolitical chessboard, a valuable trophy for propaganda. But Ali's most terrifying enemy at this minute is not in Baghdad, but in Washington. The White House is furious. President George H.W. Bush and his administration have publicly condemned this trip, calling it unauthorized freelance work, and even hinting at a betrayal of national interests. Imagine this level of isolation. Your own government, which is supposed to protect you, effectively declares you a pariah, a useful idiot, playing into the enemy's hands on the eve of war. U.S. diplomats received a tacit order: do not help, do not intervene, distance yourselves. Ali flew into the beast's lair absolutely alone, stripped of diplomatic immunity, stripped of support, surrounded only by a handful of loyal friends and a wall of misunderstanding. Why did he do it? Why would a 48-year-old invalid who struggles to tie his shoelaces climb into the epicenter of a brewing conflict, where he could be taken hostage just as easily as the rest? The newspapers wrote that it was a PR stunt, an attempt to regain fading glory, that his aging ego demanded attention. But the truth hidden behind the headlines turns everything upside down and makes you feel ashamed of those suspicions. Ali didn't fly there for photo ops. He flew there to bring back 15 American men, engineers, teachers, laborers, whom Iraqi intelligence had dragged from their homes and hotels to place them as live targets in chemical weapons factories. These people were doomed. Their lives were bargaining chips in Saddam's trade with the West, and no one, not the UN, not the Pope, not the Red Cross, could get them out. Ask yourself honestly, could you, knowing that your body betrays you every second, travel to a war zone for 15 strangers when even your country's president tells you don't go? It was an act of suicidal altruism, but the true horror of the situation lay not in the tanks on the streets of Baghdad, nor in the threats from the White House. A mortal danger was ticking right inside Ali's jacket pocket, and no one knew about it except his closest circle. It was a small, inconspicuous plastic object, a bottle of pills. Levodopa, the drug that replaces dopamine in the brain of a Parkinson's patient. Without these pills, Ali doesn't just shake harder, he turns to stone. His muscles stiffen, his throat spasms so he cannot swallow or speak, and his consciousness becomes a hostage to a paralyzed body. Ali, in his naive belief in humanity, counted on a quick visit. Fly in, talk, take the people, fly out. He brought a supply of medicine for exactly 3 days. He failed to account for one thing. Saddam Hussein is a master of psychological torture who loves to make people wait. The dictator knew that time was working against the boxer, and as Ali descended the ramp into the stifling Iraqi night, he didn't even suspect that the bottle in his pocket had already begun its countdown, and that every swallowed pill brought him not closer to relief, but closer to the moment of total, terrifying physical helplessness in the captivity of a tyrant. What happens when the pills run out and the audience is still not granted? This question hung in the air, heavier than the smell of gunpowder, but Ali took a step forward into the darkness of the unknown, clutching in his hand not a weapon, but his faith, which was about to undergo its most brutal stress test. To understand the true nature of the hell Muhammad Ali voluntarily descended into, you must forget about torture in secret service, dungeons, or physical violence, because Saddam Hussein was a much more sophisticated sadist. He used time as a weapon of mass destruction. Ali checked into the Al Rashid Hotel, expecting the audience to take place the next morning. After all, he is the most recognizable Muslim on the planet, a man for whom wars were paused. But morning came, and the phone in the room remained silent. A day passed. A second passed. The silence in the suite became deafening, broken only by the sound of the plastic bottle opening. That very dagger we loaded at the start of the story. With every click of the cap, Ali wasn't just taking medicine. He was counting down the seconds to his own physical collapse, and he realized with horror that Iraqi intelligence likely knew everything about his condition down to the smallest detail. You think this was a random bureaucratic delay? You are deeply mistaken. This was a planned siege, timed by the hour, where the stakes were not just a meeting, but human dignity. By the 4th day, the supply of levodopa, the fuel that kept his brain working and his body moving, ran dry, and what the doctors feared most began: the off effect. Imagine being inside your own body, but the control panel suddenly stops responding to commands. You want to take a step, but your legs feel cast in concrete. You want to say a word, but your tongue turns into a clumsy piece of meat that doesn't fit in your mouth. Ali began to turn into a statue right in his room. His famous speech, that very poetry of the ring, vanished, giving way to unintelligible, agonizing mumbling, and the face that was once the most mobile and expressive in the world froze in a dead mask of indifference. But the most terrifying thing wasn't happening to his muscles, but to his breathing. Without medication, the chest muscles begin to spasm, turning every breath into a fight for survival, and Ali was literally suffocating while lying on the silk sheets of a luxury hotel. And here occurs a twist that makes you question the reality of what is happening. In this moment of critical vulnerability, it is not Iraqi executioners who come to him, but American diplomats. You think they brought help? You think they organized a secret shipment of medicine through the Red Cross? Ask yourself honestly, what would the state do for its hero? The answer will shock you. They came to finish off his will. Embassy representatives, seeing his condition, told him plainly, "Leave. You are dying. You are embarrassing yourself and the country. Saddam will never receive you. He is just laughing at you." It was the perfect moment to escape, a legitimate excuse to return home, a hero who tried, but health failed, and no one would have judged him. But Ali, who at that moment could barely lift a glass of water, committed an act whose logic cannot be explained by the instinct of self-preservation. He looked at the diplomats with his frozen eyes, in which, despite the illness, burned the same fire that scorched Foreman in Zaire, and gathering all his strength to overcome the jaw paralysis, squeezed out a categorical no. He didn't just refuse to leave, he decided to go on the attack. Deprived of medication, experiencing hellish physical pain with every movement, he ordered, with gestures as his voice was almost gone, to be taken into the city. Why? Why would a dying man drag himself into the heat of Baghdad streets? It seems like madness until you understand his strategy. He knew Saddam was watching his every step, and he decided to show the dictator that his spirit could not be broken. He visited schools, he walked through markets, he prayed in mosques, dragging a disobedient leg behind him, shaking with his whole body, but never hiding his eyes. The Iraqis, ordinary people on the streets, saw not a sick old man. They saw a saint who had come to share their fate under the threat of bombing. Crowds surrounded him, chanting his name, and this noise of the streets became the pressure that even a dictator could not ignore forever. But the price of this publicity was monstrous. Every evening, returning to the hotel, Ali collapsed on the bed exhausted, his body cramped by convulsions so strong that his assistants had to literally knead his muscles for hours so he could sleep even a little. The bottle was empty, absolutely empty. And on the seventh day, when it seemed Ali's body had reached the point of no return and that he would die here, in this room, never having seen the hostages, the telephone rang in the silence. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a diplomat. It was Saddam Hussein's personal secretary. The dictator was ready to receive him. But there was one problem, one final cruel nuance that turned this news into a catastrophe. Ali could no longer speak. How do you negotiate the life and death of 15 people if you cannot utter a single word? How do you convince a tyrant who respects only strength if you look like the weakest version of yourself? Ali began to prepare for the meeting, realizing he had no words, no health, and no support. He had only his legend, and he had to bet it all in one final silent wager. When the heavy oak doors of the Republican Palace groaned open, revealing a cavern of marble and gold designed to make anyone entering feel like an insignificant insect, Muhammad Ali stepped not into a reception hall, but into the epicenter of a vacuum where the air had been sucked out by fear. It was cold inside, unnaturally, gravely cold due to air conditioners running at full power, and for Ali, whose body was depleted by a week of waiting and lack of dopamine, this cold became a physical torture comparable to electric shocks. He didn't walk. He shuffled, dragging his feet across the polished floor that reflected his trembling silhouette like a funhouse mirror, and every step was a separate war of his will against his own neurology. You think the scariest thing in this room was the dictator sitting on a dais surrounded by armed guards? You are mistaken. The scariest thing was what was happening inside Ali's skull. He knew he had a maximum of 5 minutes of relative clarity before his jaw would lock completely in a spasm, and he would lose the ability to produce even the simplest sounds. Saddam Hussein watched this approach with a smile that made the blood run cold. It was not a smile of hospitality. It was the smile of a predator watching a wounded gazelle limp into its lair. He saw the tremor of Ali's hands, saw his glassy gaze, saw how his jacket hung on emaciated shoulders, and in that moment, the dictator was sure he had already won. Iraqi state television cameras were broadcasting live, and Saddam craved exactly this image: the great American hero, broken and pathetic, crawling to him on his knees to beg for mercy. He counted on a grand propaganda victory, on footage of the champion of the great Satan kissing his hand. But right here, at the moment when the distance between them closed to a couple of meters, the script written by Iraqi intelligence went to hell because they failed to account for one factor. Ali did not come to beg. Saddam spoke first, his voice booming under the arches of the hall, full of fake cordiality. He called Ali brother, praised his past merits, clearly enjoying his power over the legend. He asked about his health, which sounded like mockery of a man who could barely stand. Everyone in the room, translators, guards, American aides, expected Ali to nod, hand over the credentials, and sit down obediently. But instead, Ali did something that made the guards' fingers tighten on the triggers of their automatic rifles. He did not bow. He did not smile back. He raised his shaking left hand, the very one deprived of medicine, living its own life, and with a sharp chopping gesture, interrupted the dictator in mid-sentence. Do you understand what happened? In 1990, Iraq, interrupting Saddam Hussein, was tantamount to suicide. The hall plunged into a visual silence so dense, it seemed time had frozen in amber. The security tensed, awaiting the order to liquidate. No one breathed. Only the hum of the cameras and the raspy, wet breathing of Ali, who was fighting his own throat, trying to unclench spasmodic vocal cords, could be heard. Saddam froze, his smile slipping to reveal confusion. He was used to fear, to flattery, to please, but he had never encountered a man who, while physically helpless, looked down on him. Ali leaned forward, breaking safety protocol, forcing the dictator to lean toward him as well, and wheezed words that the translator, pale with terror, was afraid to translate. I didn't come here as an American, Ali squeezed out, and every word came with pain as if he were spitting stones. I came as a Muslim, and in Islam, we do not hold guests against their will. Ask yourself, do you understand the genius of this move? He didn't beg for the lives of the hostages by appealing to a humanism Saddam didn't possess. He struck the tyrant's only unprotected spot, his religious image. He flipped the board. Now Saddam was not the master of the situation, but a man violating the laws of hospitality of his own faith. The translator stumbled. Tell Saddam he is a bad Muslim, in his own palace. But Ali's eyes, burning with fanatical fire through the mask of illness, left him no choice. When the phrase was spoken in Arabic, the silence in the hall became ringing. Saddam looked at this shaking old man, and in his eyes one could read something no one had seen for years: doubt. He realized that before him was not a political pawn, but a mirror of conscience that could not be broken or intimidated. Ali bet everything, his life, the lives of 15 hostages, on one psychological card, that even a monster wants to look like a hero in the eyes of someone he himself considers great. And as Saddam drew breath to answer, no one in that room, including Ali himself, knew if the next sound would be the sound of liberation or the sound of a pistol cocking. The second the echo of Ali's words about the laws of hospitality faded under the palace arches, time in Baghdad didn't just stop, it stretched into a thin, vibrating string, ready to snap and decapitate anyone in the room. Saddam Hussein slowly, terrifyingly slowly, rose from his gilded throne, and his face, usually impenetrable as a sphinx mask, twisted into a grimace that no one present could decipher. Was it rage? Was it contempt? The guards clattered their bolts. The translator squeezed his eyes shut, expecting an arrest order, and in that moment, it seemed Ali's insane bet was lost, that he had overestimated the remnants of humanity in the beast. But then something happened that made everyone question reality. Saddam laughed. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was the laugh of a chess player who realized he had just been checkmated in 3 moves, and he appreciated the beauty of the combination. The dictator realized what CIA analysts had missed. If he executed or arrested Ali, he would become a monster in the eyes of the entire Islamic world. But if he let him go empty-handed, he would show weakness before America. Ali, this shaking, barely speaking old man, had backed him into a corner from which there was only one exit that allowed him to save face. Saddam stepped right up to Ali, invading his personal space, and looking directly into the lenses of the Iraqi cameras, uttered a phrase that should have entered history textbooks, but was forgotten by the world. I will not do this for George Bush. I will not do this for America, but I will do this for Muhammad Ali, because he is a great man. You think that was the end of the tension? You think, after those words, everyone hugged and went home? That is exactly what the hostages wanted to believe as they were led out of prison cells, but reality was much more cruel and physiological. Saddam signed the decree, but the bureaucracy of a totalitarian regime is a machine that doesn't know how to break instantly. 15 American men, exhausted, terrified, disbelieving their luck, were taken to the hotel where their savior awaited. They expected to see a hero, a giant radiating strength and confidence. But when they entered the lobby, they saw something that plunged them into a shock deeper than the fear of execution. In the chair sat a man who resembled a wax figure more than a living being. Ali couldn't stand up to greet them. He couldn't smile. His body, deprived of dopamine for the 7th day in a row, had finally turned to stone. The off effect had reached its terminal stage. His muscles were so rigid, he looked like a prisoner bound in invisible shackles, and his face, that legendary calling card, expressed absolutely nothing. No joy, no relief, only a frozen mask of suffering. The hostages, grown men who had been through the hell of captivity, looked at him and didn't understand. What is wrong with him? Why isn't he reacting? Is this the price of their freedom? But the real gut punch, that very intellectual epiphany that flips the perception of the whole story, happened on board the plane as the landing gear lifted off Iraqi soil, carrying them away from the war. Euphoria reigned in the cabin. People wept, laughed, popped champagne, celebrating their rebirth. One of the freed men, Harry Moore, decided to approach Ali, who was sitting in the first row staring motionlessly out the window, to say a simple human thank you. He walked up to the champion's seat, knelt down, and suddenly his gaze fell on the tray table in front of Ali. There was no food, no water. There lay a single object, small, orange, semi-translucent. It was that pill bottle, absolutely empty. And in that second, Harry was hit by a realization so powerful it took his breath away. He remembered doctors talking about Parkinson's. He knew these pills were life for such a patient. He looked at the empty plastic, then at Ali's stone face, down which tears were flowing that he couldn't wipe away because his hands wouldn't obey, and the puzzle came together. Ali didn't just feel bad. He intentionally, consciously starved his brain. He gave up the only thing that allowed him to function as a human being in order to stretch his time supply in Baghdad. He knew that if the pills ran out, he would turn into a vegetable, but he stayed anyway, day after day emptying that bottle until there was nothing left but dust. Do you understand the scale of this sacrifice? He didn't give money. He didn't use connections. He literally gave a piece of his life, a piece of his health that could never be reclaimed, because every day without therapy inflicted irreversible damage on his neurons. He traded his ability to move, speak, and smile for their ability to return home to their families. Harry Moore took that empty bottle with a trembling hand, and in that moment, the noise of the engines, the laughter of the freed people, everything vanished. Only silence remained, and the understanding that the man sitting before him had committed a feat that no president, no army in the world could replicate. He defeated a dictator not with the force of arms, but with the force of self-sacrifice, turning his own flesh into a shield for 15 strangers. And as the plane climbed, carrying them to a safe America, Ali sat motionless, trapped inside his body, having paid the full price for a miracle no one but him believed in. When the plane's landing gear touched the runway at JFK Airport, and 15 rescued Americans stepped onto their native soil, the air filled with cries of joy, tears of reunion, and the flashes of hundreds of cameras. But in the center of this celebration of life gaped a black hole that most people chose not to notice. You probably expect the next scene to transport us to the lawn of the White House, where President George H.W. Bush presents Muhammad Ali with the Medal of Freedom, while a military band plays the anthem in honor of a hero who did the impossible without firing a single shot. That is exactly the ending Hollywood would have shown, but the reality of 1990 was written not by screenwriters, but by cynical spin doctors for whom Ali's success was not a cause for pride, but a source of the deepest, stinging humiliation. Instead of a red carpet and state honors, Ali was met with a wall of icy silence from official Washington. The presidential administration didn't just ignore his feat, they did everything possible to erase it from the news agenda, calling the mission unauthorized freelance work, that allegedly played into the hands of Iraqi propaganda. Imagine this level of absurdity. A man who saved 15 citizens of his country from certain death was greeted not as a savior, but as an inconvenient problem to be swept under the rug, because his triumph shone too bright a light on the impotence of the world's most powerful diplomacy. But the real blow, which was scarier than political ignorance, awaited Ali not in the newspapers, but in his doctor's office a few days after his return. Remember that empty pill bottle? That very dagger we observed on the plane? The price Ali paid for his week without dopamine in Baghdad turned out not to be temporary, but irreversible. Doctors, upon examining him, were horrified because the stress and abrupt withdrawal of medication had inflicted such damage on his nervous system that he could never recover from it. You think he just rested and went back to normal. That is the lie fans comforted themselves with. The truth is that Muhammad Ali left not only his health in Iraq, he left the last remnants of his physical freedom there. After that trip, his speech became even worse. His tremor intensified, and that spark of energy that allowed him to occasionally appear in public was almost completely extinguished. He literally burned his time, his future years of relatively active life, throwing them into the furnace to save strangers, and he did so fully aware that no one, except the people he saved, would ever say thank you. And here occurs the final twist, that very effect of inverted reality that forces you to rethink the very concept of heroism. While politicians and experts in expensive suits argued on TV that Ali was a useful idiot in Saddam's hands, that he allowed the dictator to look humane, 15 families in different corners of America were setting the table, celebrating Christmas with fathers and husbands who should have been lying in unmarked graves in the Iraqi desert. For these people, Ali was not a propaganda tool or a former boxer. He was an angel who descended into hell when God was too busy with politics. One of the hostages later said a phrase that should be carved on a monument to this event. The president could start a war, but only Ali could bring peace. But history, as we know, is written by the victors, and in 1991, textbooks dedicated to Operation Desert Storm, you will not find a single line about how a shaking old man stopped the execution of hostages with his presence alone. The system tried to forget this episode because it was too uncomfortable, a reminder that humanity and mercy can be more effective weapons than cruise missiles. And so now, as we know the full price of this deed, a price measured not in dollars, but in irreversibly destroyed neurons and years of life, I want to leave you with a question that will divide you into two irreconcilable camps. We are used to calling heroes those who defeat enemies with force, who kill for their country. But are we ready to recognize as a hero someone who kills himself to save others, and does so against the will of his own country? Who was Muhammad Ali on that trip? A naive, sick man manipulated by a cunning dictator for a pretty picture, as skeptics claimed? Or was he the only adult in a room full of children playing with guns, the only one who understood that the lives of 15 ordinary people are worth more than geopolitical ambitions and national pride? Whose side are you on in this dispute? On the side of the pragmatic state that thinks in millions and strategies, or on the side of the mad boxer who thinks in hearts and souls? Write your opinion in the comments, because your answer says more about your values than you think. Was it an act of stupidity or an act of holiness? I will wait for your words.